Thanks very much, everybody. Welcome to GrantTree Fundamentals. I have loads of stuff to say on this, and I'm not getting the work done in time. So I will keep. I got up at 6 o'clock this morning to start this, so I am taking it seriously that I need to start on time. Clearly, I need to start clarifying a bit more what I'm going to try and put in, because I already wrote enough for next week as well. Okay. Before I start, a little bit of admin, a few things. If anybody else is interested in getting involved in GrantTree Fundamentals, if people have stuff that they want to present on, or topics that they're interested in, whether they want to do that on their own, whether they want to do that in collaboration with me, please come and grab me and talk about that if we have one-to-ones, talk about it, or just come and get me. Very interested in that. We are due a monthly consulting session with Versus. Remember, they are our coaches as a whole business. So I definitely have stuff that's a 2-hour session. I definitely have stuff which I can take to that. If other people have things on their mind that they see as big problems that we're currently facing, that we want advice on how to solve, they give us advice about strategy and operations, kind of within an open culture perspective, but they are here to help us do better business. So again, please come and talk about that. People and things that I've appreciated this week. I really appreciated, I had an excellent, honest conversation with George yesterday where he gave me some really good feedback about stuff that I've been doing. I also see this really excellent feedback, which I'm finding really useful in the pay assessment stuff that's been completed about me. I'm very grateful for the fact that everyone's remaining very patient with this pay process. I know could somebody mute, because that echo coming on every 30 seconds is otherwise really going to distract me. I really appreciate that everybody's giving time to the pay process and being honest about what they're finding frustrating so that we can learn from it and get better next time. Another bit of admin. Last week I made a point and I didn't make it perhaps as well as I could have done, so I wanted to go back and clarify it. And, I don't think I left people with the right takeaway. So I was talking about things that are egolytic, things that give you a sense of connectedness, of being part of something that's larger than yourself. Ego is where you get your self-identity, so egolytic is having less self-identity. And there are a whole load of things that you can do that, there are a whole load of things that you can do, right? These are some of them, which have an egolytic effect. And I'm not saying that we should, or indeed can, particularly think about this one, go out and do all of these, right? Or that these are things that it's appropriate for us to do in a work context. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is people do these things, and they are enjoyable, I argue, because of this effect, because they promote empathy. And the point that I'm really trying to make is that, there is this kind of GrantTree feeling, right? And it's really us at our best. And it's not just something that happens at tea nights out, it's something that happens every day. And I'm sure that everybody here, or I hope that everybody is here, has had some sense of that, and what that can be, and understands that it is a kind of magical feeling, and this is about saying, well, actually that's about an empathetic environment. Thinking about my experience of GrantTree and the environment here, right from day one, from when I started, when it was 18 months ago, as a contractor doing the lead gen research. Right, when I started as a contractor, and Amal's comments with Paulina after my interview were, I think he'll work from home a lot, I don't think he's really going to fit in, right? From day one, I found this a very supportive environment. Before I came to GrantTree, I found it very hard to laugh at myself, right? To laugh at my own ridiculousness, because we're all ridiculous, because we're all people. Now I can do that. I find it very supportive. I also have an experience at GrantTree where I come in, and even if work is stressful, like let's say yesterday, I actually find myself thinking, I don't really notice that I'm at work, because I'm just enjoying the experience of being alive so much. And again, that's about the environment that we have. And think about the commercial application, right? If you're lost in work, if you're really enjoying work, if you're having such a good time that you don't notice you're working, are you going to do better work? Are you going to achieve more? Another thing that I want to think about the way in which empathy is in the everyday is this quote from Gottman, which I first brought up in the feedback presentation last year. And he's a guy who writes a lot about couples and couple relationships. He's a pioneering therapist there, did a lot of large-scale studies where they looked at big cohorts of relationships and what predicted that they would work well and where there would be problems. And this is one of his observations, right, from his lifetime work. The very issues that cause the most pain and alienation can also be the greatest sources of intimacy and connection. And what he's talking about here is an observation that in couples in long-term relationships, those who handle conflict in a way that is kind of gentle and caring, right, don't have any more or less conflict than couples who divorce, but they handle it in a better way, and they actually find that conflict itself is an opportunity to strengthen their relationships, which is counterintuitive because we think that it's in conflict that the relationships are more likely to fall apart. Oh, that's just the same slide again. Okay, that's the end of the admin. That's kind of the process. So last week I was talking about empathy in general, and I said that one of the things that I was going to talk about this week was that some kinds of conflict are really just more of a breakdown in empathy than they are being about a particular thing. So I wanted to talk a bit more about that. Different colour, you see, because now we're on to the main slides. Just as a health warning, right, I'm going to use some real examples here, and over the coming weeks I might use real examples as well. And you may find those examples resonate with you. You may think, oh, that's about me, or oh, that's about Dan, or whatever it is that you feel. And you know, that may be true, but there's also a partial truth, at least in the fact that these experiences are both universally human and uniquely personal. The sort of examples, bless you, the sort of examples that I'm going to talk about may resonate with you because of that universal component, but then you see the deeply personal bit of it and you make the meaning that that's what I'm intending to do. That's not what I'm intending to do.
We'll move it from root minus server.
Oh, well, how exciting. Lucky that person for being moved from the root. What is conflict about, right? We tend to think that conflict is about something, that there is a problem, that something has occurred. But is that kind of really the case? Right? Do we actually define that we think that conflict is this big, terrible thing, and actually it's a little man behind a curtain? You know, one of the things about problems, conflicts in general, is that they tend to get bigger over time, right? They tend to get potentially more threatening over time. And let's think about how this happens, right? If we deal with a problem while it's happening, it's relatively small. Maybe the next thing is that we have a quick word afterwards, and that's, you know, that's maybe a bit bigger. But then if you have had an issue, and it was, let's say, 2 months ago, and then you have a feedback mingle and you discuss it, right? Is that easier to raise than it was immediately afterwards, or more difficult? Right? And then again, what happens actually if you don't manage to even talk about it in the feedback mingle and you carry that with you for 6 months or 2 years or, you know, the rest of your life, right? How big a problem is that going to become? How easy is that going to be to talk about? And notice that the need to have the conversation, the difficult conversation, doesn't go away. Right? If you just had a difficult conversation at the moment that the problem was happening, you wouldn't get to hear. On the other hand, we do all have, and will all have, at some point in our lives, problems that we don't feel capable of dealing with at the time. We're too tired, we're emotional, we're hungry, whatever it is. And equally, we will have problems that just sort of build up and we never manage to quite get round to talking about, or don't talk about for a long time. It's a very human process. But do notice that it gets bigger and it gets harder to do. At the same time, the solution gets smaller. This is the example that I'm going to talk about. And this is particularly on my mind because I spent the weekend with some friends. My friend Helen is a secondary school teacher, or she's also an author, but she's doing some supply teaching, and we were talking about this. She hears kids say this a lot, and the way that schools handle this is changing, certainly changing since, you know, I was at school, whenever that was, over a decade ago. Now, you know, it's still something that sometimes I hear, and I don't enjoy hearing that. I know that when people say that, they just mean, oh, it's kind of rubbish, right? It's kind of slang. But I hear, you know, an attack because I am gay, and gay here is being used to mean bad, and therefore I rationalise that being gay is bad, right? It feels like an attack on me. Now, there are different ways that I can handle this. Right? If I handle this straight away, I can say, oh, I actually feel a bit uncomfortable that you're using this phrase. I'd rather that you didn't. I know you don't mean, or I make up that you don't mean anything by it, but this is how I'm left feeling when you use it. That's quite a powerful request to make, because I made it in the moment. Another person can do something about it. They can say, oh, I'm sorry that happened. Yeah, I guess I wasn't thinking. I guess maybe I should, you know, revisit the fact that that's a phrase that I use. I hadn't really thought about it. You know, alternatively, we do that thing where, you know, we have a chat a little bit while later and I say, oh, you know, earlier today, you know, you kind of said this and I felt this. But what happens if that goes from, you know, when you said this earlier today to when you said this last week to when you said this last year? You know, I see that the impact of these goes down, because if I say to you, oh, last year you said something to me and I kind of felt that, right? I mean, what can we really do about that? You know, if you say sorry to me now, is that really going to be something that's going to help me? Whereas perhaps if you said sorry to me straight away, while the emotion is kind of still there, while the actual feeling is still there, you know, then I'm going to feel better. So solutions get smaller over time while problems get bigger over time, and the question that I'm asking is why? You know, what's going on? What's this all about? This is about a cycle of doing and seeing. So in this example, somebody says that's okay, meaning this is rubbish, right? That's what they do. Now what I see is something else. I see them saying that's okay, that's my observation. This is OIJ, observation, interpretation, judgment. It's a really useful framework for kind of debugging our understanding of what's going on in the world around us. So I observe them saying this. I interpret that this is about me in some way, you know, that I'm making kind of a personal meaning out of it, and I make this judgment about the other person. I say, well, they're being a dick by saying this, right? So what happens, because this is what I've seen? Well, I'm going to act in a way that's in line with what I'm seeing, which is they're being a dick. So I'm going to leave the room, right? I'm going to leave the room in a huff. Yeah, if you can't leave the room in a huff, leave the room in a minute and a half. Anyway, never mind. It's a Groucho Marx joke, I'm sorry. So yeah, I'm going to leave the room. Now what are they going to see, right? Are they going to see me leaving the room? And are they going to say, oh, he's storming off in a huff. He is being a dick. Right? So I think, oh, I'm being reasonable by leaving the room. They're seeing he's being a dick. And what does this do to what they do in response? They're not going to stop using the phrase, are they? Because, you know, like, they think, oh, well, if he's being a dick, why should I modify my behaviour? Now, this cycle goes round. So they don't stop using the phrase. So I see, well, they're not doing anything. You know, I've left the room, they're not asking me how I am, they're indifferent to this, they don't like me. Right? So what am I going to do now that I'm making this meaning that they don't like me? I'm going to avoid them, I'm going to be less friendly to them. When I'm avoiding them and being less friendly, what are they going to see? Right? They're going to see, well, he's not talking to me, he's avoiding me, he doesn't like me. Right? What are they going to do in response to that, given that's what they're seeing? They're not going to talk to me. Right? They're not talking to me, and I'm going to start making the meaning that they don't like me. I'm talking to them. I think this is really important. Look at this, we're both doing the same thing. Right? This is a reinforcing loop. It just goes round and round and round. The more I don't talk to you, the more you think I don't like you, the more you don't talk to me. The more you don't talk to me, the more I think that you don't like me, the more I don't talk to you. See how rapidly this has moved from a situation where you said this is so gay and I left the room. I mean, it's not going to happen like that, but it will get to this point after all. What is the difference between this slide and the next slide? Well, there isn't one. Okay, great. So yeah, this is a self-reinforcing loop, right? It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a sort of spiral. What rapidly happened was we started with a specific problem, which was something that you said that I didn't like, and we got into a situation where it became about maintaining a particular dynamic which reinforced itself. I remember I talked about this a lot when we were talking about the workflow stuff. It applies here as well. This is about systemic thinking. This is about thinking, how could this be not actually about you, or necessarily even about me, but about our dynamic, about our relationship, about the system of the two of us, right? So this is how a problem gets bigger over time through that spiral. You know, we had something which was a small incident, which we dealt with it then and then, could have been forgotten and moved on from. But instead, we carried it around and it's got bigger and bigger. And actually one of the things that happens is, as we get into that loop where, you know, it starts to develop and we get into more something like we're not talking because they don't like me, then every little thing that you do is added to my pile of reasons why you're a dick, which sort of get layered over and over and over. You know, like the slow drip of water from the ceiling of a cave making a stalagmite. Bigger and bigger and bigger over time, layer, layer, layer over time. So that the original problem, which was only that big, is stuck in the middle and we can't get to it, surrounded by this toxic load of other stuff. Right? This creates a backlog. Now, if you remember in the stories of 2015, I was talking about how one of the things that we did really well last year was we started to deal with our organizational backlog. Right? If you don't have a functioning tension resolution mechanism within your system, then you're going to get a backlog over time. You can't start doing which, as Don rightly said last week, we want to get good at doing this stuff while it's small and low cost and while the solution is effective. but you can't deal with the problems while they're small and low cost if you're carrying around with you this massive problem that you can't talk about because it's become so big, right? So the small problems just keep getting added. Let's look at a couple of other examples of how this dynamic sustains itself. This is a kind of more generic version of this, right? This is the nag misbehavior loop, right? I see somebody is causing trouble, and I ask for it to stop. They see me nagging, and in return they choose to do what they want, right? The more I nag, or rather the more I ask for it to stop, the more it carries on, yeah? Here's another version of this loop, right? You know, this is one that is quite often familiar to people who are gay, right? Or have something that they have to tell their parents. Their parents don't necessarily know. They don't talk about me being gay. I make up a meaning that they don't approve, so I don't talk about it. They see that I don't talk about it. They assume that I want privacy. They don't ask me about it. Where actually is the problem? It just goes round and round and round. My friend Emily solved this problem by writing a book about being a lesbian. That's fixed it for her. But you have to break the cycle somehow, right? Oh, that's the same slide again. Here's another version. It's a very similar variant, right? This is familiar to me. Perhaps it's familiar to other people. You know, instead of not talking about being gay, we don't talk about my work, right? They don't talk about my work and they don't value it, so I don't talk about it with them. He doesn't talk about his work. He doesn't want me to know. He's keeping secrets. He's trying to exclude me, right? So, you know, we're all not talking about the problem, right? And it's the dynamic that's the issue. So this is one of the ways in which some of the advice that Stephen Cohen, who Versus have given us before, is that if you have a poorly structured organization, if the structures around your workflow are not right, then you get a lot of surface problems which are a result of that. Right? This is a surface problem. If the relationship is structured such that information isn't flowing about work in a clear way, it's very easy to get locked in this cycle where we say, oh, well, information isn't flowing and therefore there must be a problem and therefore we start sustaining this dynamic, right? But what is this dynamic overall? This dynamic is actually about being a dick, right? This is what all of these things are basically saying. Somebody is doing whatever, somebody else is making a meaning that they're being a dick, they're doing whatever in response, and in return, the loop is completed by seeing that they're being a dick. And it just goes round and round and round. Now, what is this all about, this idea of being a dick, right? What's going on? Here's a question that I didn't think that any of you thought you will be asked this afternoon. Is a dick an object? Remember last week I talked about this distinction between being in the box and out of the box. When we're in the box, we lack empathy and we see others as objects, problems, nuisances, obstacles, threats, villains, and maybe a dick as well, right? When we're out of the box, we have empathy and we see others as people. So I want to go back actually to the nag misbehavior loop, right? This is about saying, like, I'm asking for it to stop and you see that I'm nagging. Now, if you empathize with me and I say to you, something that you're doing is causing me a problem, if I see your problem as real, right, am I likely to say, oh, this person is nagging, or am I likely to think, oh, actually, that's something that I should know about, that this person has a problem and I understand their needs and I should react to that, right? But one reason why you might be seeing me as nagging, if you remember something I said last week, is we respond to mindset. When someone is in the box to us, we respond to that. So if I ask for the behavior to stop, but I'm in the box to you, you're not going to respond well and you're more likely to see it as nagging. Whereas if I'm empathizing with you as seeing you as a real person, then the response is more likely to be welcomed. But it flows backwards as well. If I'm empathizing with you and seeing as a real person, then when I see your behavior that's causing trouble, rather than making the meaning that you're being a dick, right, to go back to that in a few slides time. Yeah, rather than making the meaning that you're being a dick, I'm probably going to think, well, you know, this person must not see how this is affecting me, or they must have other stuff going on for them. This is the classic Omra dance floor example. When somebody bumps into you on the dance floor, it's not that they don't think that you're important, it's that they probably didn't even notice you weren't in their worldview at the time. They were doing this. You're shaking your head, but it's true, it's true. You see, and the reason it's true is because self-deception has occurred, right? You've probably done this without realizing. I'll come on to that in a minute. So is a dick an object? Oh yeah. So like saying that somebody's a dick is about being in a box. Don't Google the phrase "dick in a box" with safe search off, because that's quite a shock. So it's really about bringing a breakdown in empathy. This is what I'm saying. It's a lot of conflict is about breakdown in empathy more than it is about the original problem. The bigger problem is the breakdown in empathy. Fix the empathy first, and then the problem will follow. Right? First, get out of the box. But remember that getting out of the box, rebuilding empathy with someone, will make it easier to fix the problem, because we respond to mindset. When other people are out of the box to us, we're more receptive to their requests. It also gets us off the hook in the sense that if we use the wrong phrase, if we're not perfect in our communication, other people will sense the fact that we have a sincere intent to be helpful, to be useful, that we care about them as a person. Empathy is infectious. The more I am out of the box to you, the more likely you are to receive my request in a way that leaves you out of the box and makes you want to help me. This is all theory one. This is a conversation I had at the weekend about theory X, theory Y, and my friend Joe said, well, these ideas have been around for a long time. It's kind of, it's silly to say that McGregor invented these ideas. And I was like, well, I think actually that's why he called them theory X and theory Y. They're just these kind of generic names for behaviours and thoughts and sort of patterns that have existed for a while. And he was just interested in testing this idea of whether they were self-reinforcing, and of course his big finding was they were self-reinforcing. The more you behave to people in a way that assumes that they deserve your trust, the more they will behave in a way that creates trust. If you advance trust, it will be repaid. So I mentioned that sort of idea of the spiral. These dynamics have a life of their own. They become sort of self-sustaining. Now, I think I mentioned this in an earlier fundamentals talk, and I can't remember which one it was, so I can't find a diagram. But last year, when we did our Vision Day, Richard introduced us to the 3 horizons, which is really useful. It's a really interesting thing to read up on, by the way. I'll try and post a link to it on Slack after the talk. But the point about 3 horizons is a way about talking about change and planning for the future. And essentially, there's an idea that we're currently in Horizon 1, right? That's the system we're in now, which is going to decline over time. And Horizon 3, which is the future, is going to come on board. And then Horizon 2 is the transition. But one of the ways in which the 3 horizon stuff is a really useful thinking tool is because it comes with the assumption that systems are conservative. Systems will try and reassert themselves. So we're currently in Horizon 1. If we want to change stuff and move into the future, one of the reasons we need a strong transitionary phase is because Horizon 1 will constantly try and come back. The way of doing things before will constantly try and come back. Organizations exist almost, it seems sometimes, to squash innovation. If we think about what open culture is about broadly, if you think about, like holacracy, and there are all kinds of thoughts that you might have about whether holacracy is actually quite a cumbersome system. They call it an operating system for a business. It's definitely a way of doing open culture. But there are a lot of rules. It is very rule-driven. But the reason that holacracy exists is because Brian Robertson, who founded Holacracy 1, set up this company called Ternary Software. And he set up Ternary Software because he said, I observed that people seem to have this kind of natural desire to want to go out and create something. And most organizations, and most of the things that organizations do, seem to be there to get in the way. This is why I love having I don't know if this will be okay to say on video, so I'll say it sort of euphemistically, but this is why I love having our new neighbors here. Because one of the things that I observe is that they're these 2 quite highly functioning teams. Right? They seem to have quite an open dynamic for a hierarchical organization. They have kind of leader coaches, servant leaders who are actually we protect our team from the rest of the organization and allow them to work together as a team of equals. This is what highly functioning teams look like and have always looked like. Open culture is just about creating structures that support that end to end. So one of the dangers in bigger organizations is that you have this pocket of innovation, this pocket of high functioning come up, but then the conservative broader system of the business tries to smother it. This is one of the reasons why so few people do R&D and why it's so important to give support to people who are doing innovation, right? That's why our mission is so important in the world. So that's kind of the 3 horizons, right? The system will reassert itself. And the dynamic of these loops, they become a game that we're stuck in. But notice how we have to collaborate, we have to cooperate in order to make them happen. Right? This is why it's kind of called collusion. But we can stop at any point, right? We can put down the racket and say, I'm not going to play this game anymore. And then suddenly, actually, what we're left with is the little man behind the screen. So this is the point about the dance floor, right? Do you always know it's happening? Two of the questions that 123HR will ask you are, how could you have contributed to the problem, and what's the 2% truth? Might there be a truth of at least 2% that you are contributing to the problem in some way? Right, let's have a look at this scenario. This is a variant on the one that we looked at earlier. So someone else is saying that's okay, and here's the change. Right, when I leave the room, they don't notice because they're doing something else, or because it's not significant, or because I think that I leave the room with great drama, conveying hugely and wordlessly how strongly I feel about the situation. But none of this comes across, right? It just looks at them like I'm leaving the room. So they do nothing. And if they, so they see nothing. And if they see nothing, they do nothing, right? And then what happens is we get into this scenario where, where we're basically getting into the, the kind of being a dick scenario, but this person doesn't know that they're playing the game. Or do they? That's the question, right? Do they know that they're contributing? Are they deceiving themselves that they're not contributing to this problem? Because this is the problem with self-deception, right? If you're deceiving yourself, how do you know? How do you know? You'd have no way of knowing. I could say to you, Nikki, you're deceiving yourself about this thing, and you'd say, no, I'm not. Well, that's the point, right? You're engaged in self-deception, so you don't know you're doing it. So sometimes we get locked into these cycles and we're on this half where we say, I'm seeing nothing, doing nothing, and we are. But sometimes there's a 2% truth that we have some awareness of what's going on, and we may realise that something is going on, there is a dynamic here that we don't like. And we think, well, there's a dynamic that's going on, I'm doing nothing to contribute to it. Like, that's completely human, but it's like, well, actually, maybe it's the doing nothing which is your half of this dynamic. So instead of doing nothing, instead of just sitting there, don't just sit there, do something, we could see a problem and we could talk about it. Right? Then we have, I see a problem, I talk about it, and actually one of the things that this does is, how many differences? And is that the, okay, good, sorry, forgotten the slides that I'd done. So this is the thing, is we see a problem, we talk about it, and then the crucial thing is what this becomes is, what I now see is a good relationship and I'm working on it, and you see a good relationship and you're working on it. So instead of this scenario where it was, that's so gay, right? That could have been a problem, that could have alienated us. But we chose to talk about it, right? We chose to use this as an opportunity. We're coming back to the Gottman stuff here. We chose to use the fact that we were in potential conflict to build our relationship, which is going to help us work better together, which is going to give us more of a feeling of connectedness and empathy and the lifelong high that we're all trying to get to. Well, Jesus, that's trying to be happy. So, final thing for today. I'm talking a lot about being in the box and being out of the box and saying, first get out of the box, blah, blah. I mentioned this a little bit last week. I want to come back to it again today. Different ways of getting out of the box. Different ways of getting out of that cycle. Different ways of rebuilding empathy. The crucial thing is to leverage the opportunity that you have, right? You have if you think of like a literal box, of a literal wall of cardboard that's existing, it's like if you can get a tiny hole, it's like your Tim Robbins in Shawshank Redemption, digging away at the wall with a spoon, right? It's going to take you a while, but the point is that, like, from a little hole it becomes a big hole because you just keep scratching away in the same place. So leverage, use every opportunity that you can. One of the most powerful things that you can do, if you notice that you're seeing someone as a dick, you're seeing someone as an object, empathy is broken down. When was I out of the box? Remember, when is the someone with whom I have a good, empathetic, open relationship? When do I feel that kind of connectedness? Can I bring that memory to mind? That's going to put you in the right frame of mind. Then the thing to do is to think, what's going on here that's in my shadow? And I think this is a really important point because there often is something that started the process off. Right? Or one of the things that can be part of this dynamic, one of the things that we see in other people that we find irritating, it's very easy to point the finger and say, this person is being a dick. Right? This person over here, how many fingers are pointing at that person and how many fingers are pointing at myself? Right? When other people do things that irritate us, they're often things that we do that we don't like, that we're in denial about. That's the shadow self. You know, for me, it's being passive-aggressive. Nothing annoys me more than being passive-aggressive, but it's because I do it inadvertently, and thanks to Don and to Brian for my award for that, right? I deserved that, that was fair enough, right? And also thanks to Brian for dealing with that situation so humorously, if I haven't shown you that ever. But anyway, stuff that's in our shadow tends to be stuff that's annoying us. So if we see somebody else being a dick, you know, actually, what is it that this person's doing? And, you know, maybe I do this, or maybe I do a version of this. You know, like just thinking about the relationship between Don and I and the dynamic that we've had there. You know, if Don gets kind of passionate about something, worked up, then he gets kind of loud. He directs that kind of outwards. Whereas I tend to direct it more inwards. I get kind of emo and upset, right? And actually, one of the things that I might say is, oh, this is quite hard to relate to, because the more you're blustery, the more I become emo, right? So actually, we're in this negative cycle. Alternatively, I could say, you being blustery, actually, I don't really like. It's not really how I do stuff. But I definitely do an equivalent thing. And you know, you're doing that because of the fact that you have some emotions, and I'm doing this because I have some emotions. So actually, although we're doing this thing that's very different, and although perhaps it's quite alienating, this is a great opportunity for us to connect because we reveal the universality of what we're doing. There's also a thing which is, I find the blustery shouting and being difficult because it's stuff that I do that I'm in denial about. I'm like, oh no, I go really emo, I go really inward when I'm emotional about stuff. That's not true. I was a complete dick to one of the waiters at the Christmas party, to the extent that I actually had to go up to him and apologise, right? Because I was tired and emotional and just kind of came out. And he was very gracious and accepted the apology. But the point is, he was in my shadow all along. Sometimes we also have to let go. That's the thing, right? If the problem was about some feelings that we had, maybe we just have to let go. Feel forgiveness, you've got to forgive. I mean, what inspiring words. Are they the words of Gandhi? No, they're the words of other Manic Street preachers. But the thing about letting go is it isn't easy, right? If I hear that fucking phrase again, this baby is going to glow. The poetic of John Grant. Oh, this apparently is just let G. I'm shading women. It's a great line from Taming the Shrew, but I prefer to adjust it to say rather than ashamed that I'm sad. And this is a problem that people have in general. You know, that we tend to have a tendency to get in the box and the conflict when we could actually live with a heart at peace and have more of a tendency to empathise with other people. Finally, these words. Do not be people without minds of your own, saying that if others treat you well, you will treat them well, and if they do wrong, you will do wrong to them. Instead, accustom yourselves to do good if people do good, and not to do wrong even if they do evil. So in conclusion, next week I would like to talk about how conflicts spread from two people. This collusion dynamic can spread to a whole system and out into the world in general. And I'd like to talk a little bit more as how to act for an agent of peace and how to systematically start to heal these conflicts and other conflicts in the world. Any comments or questions?
I have actually a comment. It's more kind of an addition, an extra bit I wanted to mention. If it's okay with people, because I realise it's been quite intense, so I don't want to drown people. Okay? I'll actually, because I like to stand in front and give an explanation. Yeah, so I want to give, so a lot of your examples were about one particular type of conflict where one person pushes and the other one pulls away. You say, oh, that is so, or somebody says that is so gay, and you decide to leave. And I want to give a practical example that happened where it was pointed out to me that this conflict was happening, which was actually a meeting with Steve and Fjord, which was, we had one of those meetings with Steve, and Paulina basically was asking something around, it was ironically or topically about pay and transparency of pay, and she was asking what if we had to give up transparency in order to keep the company going? What if transparency was just not compatible with having a pay system? And I was getting quite defensive because I was hearing, well, we're going to give up the value of transparency, and I care very much about transparency. And so I was getting defensive, and by me getting defensive, Paulina was pushing some more, because she was so when somebody gets defensive when you ask them a question, naturally you start to get more insecure about whether they actually have a good point, so you start to push more, and of course as she pushed more, I got more defensive, and it was kind of, we were both pushing on each other's button to amplify the loop right there in the meeting. It felt like one of those conversations that's just keeps, both sides keep saying the same thing over and over again, and it lasted for about an hour and a half before Paulina had to go, and then Steve kindly pointed out that this was what had been going on, which was, he couldn't quite point out because we were so continually pushing each other for an hour and a half. And this leads me to a really interesting framework that I picked up in a book called Hold Me Tight, which is actually about relationships. And it talks about 3 kind of stages that conflicts between couples go through, and the same is actually true for conflicts in organizations. And if essentially you can summarize them as push, 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 pull, and pull, pull. And the third one in particular is very important, I'll get to that. The push, push is when you have like this kind of open conversation where it's just like you keep both repeating the same thing, kind of butting heads like rams endlessly.
An argument.
Yeah, like it feels like an argument where the other person isn't hearing you, and that's usually relatively easy to identify and to figure out. Okay, like this conversation isn't really going anywhere. The next, they call that the find the bad guy. They call it in the relationship context, where you keep trying to push something around, which is usually blame in a relationship. The next stage they call the protest polka, where one person pushes and the other one runs away, basically. And that can happen when you're trying to have the conversation with. That's actually a healthier stage of conversation than the third one, by the way. But it can happen when one person sees that there's a problem, but the other one doesn't really want to talk about it, and you kind of like feel like you're moving into the space and the other person's moving away. That's already more difficult to resolve than the first one, because one person's now pulling away and is kind of like running away from the problem, and then they have to turn around and face the problem in order to be able to solve it. And the third one, which is actually the most dangerous for couple relationships, is what they call the flee and freeze, where both sides have decided to turn away and kind of they can't cope with even facing that there's a problem. And I see that happen within the context of GrantTree, where both sides are saying, you know what, I don't really have a great working relationship with this person, but I don't need to. I can just go and do my stuff on this side. I don't think there's a problem. Basically, I don't want to face this problem. And when both sides are doing that, it's very difficult to bring them to the table. And I think this is a useful framework to notice also this third level of conflict, which is not so obvious as the first two. And also to realize that in order to be able to solve the problem, you're going to have to move back into one of the other 2 stages, probably into one and then the next one. And that's going to be uncomfortable because you're going from a point where both sides are actually already explicitly uncomfortable about the problem. They both don't want to face the problem. They're going to have to make that step to say, I'm going to create a conflict that I was ignoring. I'm going to resurrect a conflict that I was ignoring in order to enable the other person to also engage in that conflict in order to be able to then actually solve that conflict. And I thought that was an interesting thing to point out in terms of those legacy conflicts, particularly the really long-term ones. If you work with someone for a long time and so you build that conflict and it's a very old conflict, you're probably in that third stage where both sides are ignoring the conflict and you need to heat it up again in order to be able to solve it.
Well, actually, I mean, it's the same dynamic of the, I'm not talking about my work, you're not talking about my work. It's a kind of turning away, And that, I mean, it's very isolating for both sides, as you say. You do have to turn back. I would only just say that, just to like my take on what you're saying when you say is that you might have to, you go from the turning away to some kind of turning together. That there has to be a conflict that you resurrect. I would say that the turning away is conflict. You're locked in collusion, and actually all you're doing is you're surfacing. You're saying, this is the thing that is happening. And that may very well involve one of you turned away and one of you turned in, because one of you is saying, hey, we're in conflict and this is a problem. And if the other one is still engaged in the self-deception, then you can, they can still be turning away.
But from a subjective perspective, it's going to feel like you're creating a conflict where there isn't one, because you were kind of in denial about there being a conflict. So you're like, okay, I'm now taking this thing that I've been deliberately ignoring for a year. I've been deliberately pretending that there's no conflict. And now I actually have to face the fact that there is actually a conflict, and I've been ignoring it for a year, and it was a big thing back then, and it's an even bigger thing now.
I mean, it may feel like that, it may not do. You may think, well, actually, I've identified that there has been a conflict, there has been this collusion loop that we've been in all along, but equally to you, it may feel like yes, as you say, it may very much feel like that.
This question is probably open to the floor. Kind of when you were discussing all that stuff, Dan, I had a thought about this, and it kind of relates back to what you were saying as well. So all the different stages of conflict and the time it takes to get there and all that sort of stuff. But then also, with all of this, I'm kind of always looking at, okay, what can we do and how can we fix it? But then, what is the main constraint? Should everything else be perfect? And I think the only thing really constrains it is time. So how much time is it worth investing in actually resolving a conflict, and is it at some point do you just say, look, we've spent this amount of time, let's not spend any more time because it might not be possible to resolve it within the desired time that we have. Does that kind of make sense? How do you sort of assess that?
I definitely have, I can see that you're bursting. Do you want to go first?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Just the coffee.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, for me, there are a couple of things there. You know, one of which is actually, you know, conflicts can be solved quite quickly. Once you start to have these tools, these kind of like systemic thinking tools about, oh, actually, might I be in a collusion loop? Or might my behaviour be contributing to the problem? Might I be able to make a change to my behaviour, which actually begins to fix things, right? And one of the other tools, which is in the change pyramid, which I'm going to talk about next week, is to say, if you can't, you know, if you have a relationship dynamic that's not working well, that you're in this kind of collusion conflict with somebody, and you don't feel yet that you can approach someone who would be productive to approach someone, start by working on the relationships that you have around that relationship. Start to sort of create other stuff, right? So there are different ways that you can spend your time on this in a way that are efficient. I recognise that if you go straight into talking face to face with someone with whom you've had a difficult relationship with for a while, it might not be productive at first, and you might think, well, this is kind of a waste of time. You and I have talked before about the question of, you know, like picking your battles and how do you do that. I would again say to everybody, like the framework in difficult conversations about deciding when to have the conversation and when not to is fantastic. You know, they say we can't have every honest conversation in life that the opportunity to have comes our way, because otherwise we'd be doing nothing but doing that and we wouldn't get on with anything else. You know, it's like being here, right? We can't spend all of our time doing doctoral fundamentals, but we actually have to make some money, we actually have to do some work as well. That's also really important, right? But we have to spend some of our time, or it's helpful for us to spend some of our time thinking about this. For me, I would say, you know, if you've identified that you're in a conflict and you're trying to fix it, and you say, I've put all this time to fixing it and it's still not working, like that would suggest to me that that's a conflict that is entrenched in some way and that it still needs more work. I wouldn't be comfortable saying, I found this conflict that I'm in and, you know, I've started to fix it, but I'm going to give it, you know, 17 hours, and if it isn't fixed within 17 hours, then I'll just have to live at war with this person. That's probably not what you meant. There's a bit of a reduction, you know, to the absurd, but I'm just saying, for me, actually, it's important.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I'm just trying to get a better answer for what I'm sort of looking for is basically, I agree, definitely put in the effort and all the time of like trying to resolve it and all the tools and tricks and tips. I think that's essentially important, but just at the same time, you know, I think potentially, and I could just be spitballing here, that some relationships potentially are unsolvable in a reasonable time frame. If that assumption is true, then to what extent do you need to work on that relationship to realise that you're not going to keep going with it?
So I don't want to go into too much detail into the situation that happened with me and George over the summer and so on, but I think that was a fairly high stakes and fairly difficult conflict. It felt like one of those conflicts that may be unresolvable. Once we both got to the point where we admitted that there was a conflict that it needed to be resolved and we were both willing to come to the table and try to resolve it, it was done in, I think most of the progress was done in the first 2 meetings. So once you've actually faced the problem, as long as you're in a reasonably, I would call it my subjective view, a reasonably mature position of saying, like, you know, let's not just bang on about the past for the next 6 months, let's see how we can work together forwards. You can actually resolve the conflict fairly quickly, because you don't actually need to resolve everything that happened before. You just need to pick something, resolve that successfully, and then so satisfy yourself that any future things that come up, you will be able to talk to the person. And once you picked one of the big icebergs from the past, solve that, then every small thing that comes up in the future, you can go straight to the person and talk. It heals up the relationship really quickly. Because, you know, we're not, like, with GrantTree we have, I have a belief that we all need to have good relationships with each other. It's important for all of us, because through the advice process and the transparency, etc., we all potentially need to interact with somebody, and if we have a bad relationship with someone, we may not get the advice we need, they may feel cut out of the process, all sorts of things, like frictions will start to build up if we have a bad relationship. But at the same time, we don't need to get married with each other. You know, it is just a working relationship. You don't need to feel like this is the person that I want to spend the rest of my life with. You just need to feel like this is somebody I can talk to about any problem that I see with their behavior. I can actually express how I feel and feel like I'll be heard. That's a much lower baseline than an actual, couples relationship. So every conflict I think should be fixable, because nobody here has a really fundamental values disagreement. We all are roughly around the same area.
I think that's a really important point. Like for me, thinking of like a rule of thumb in life more generally, there are two circumstances under which I'd say I don't want to maintain my relationship with this person anymore and take a kind of conscious decision to do that. One would be, we've identified that there's some kind of collusion, conflict, dynamic in our relationship, and I want to fix it, and the other person doesn't want to engage with fixing it. Then, all I can do is just empathize with the fact that they're stuck in this and they can't get out of it. That's a very human situation, but actually I don't want that dynamic anymore. I'm not playing that game. Another circumstance would be, actually, we can have this healing conversation, but what we discover is that we have very different values and we want very different things out of life, in which case, then we respectfully, with mutual respect, part. But if somebody's willing, I think that all of these kind of conflicts, if both people go into them willingly, can be resolved. That doesn't necessarily mean that you won't reveal, a bigger value conversation which needs to be had.
I think that's, for example, if you had somebody working here who just likes to torture small animals every day for fun, that might be a values disagreement where you feel like I cannot resolve this, and like it's not something that's resolvable. But I don't think we've hired anybody like that.
So when I was thinking of the question, I wasn't actually specifically thinking of anything within GrantTree, I guess more my personal life, but then also thinking about it more in terms of GrantTree. Let's say hypothetically, if I had a conflict with someone, and like a big conflict, I don't, thankfully, but let's say I did, and it lasted for like another, 5 years that I'm here at GrantTree. That's obviously, it seems like too long a time to, like obviously I probably would have left if it was that long or something like that. The point is, I guess at some point, there is still a limit, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. How do you sort of define that limit, and how do you know what to...
Some of those legacy conflicts that we're dealing with at the moment have basically been around for about 3 years, and they've only built up over that time, and we're now finally sort of puncturing them and deflating them a bit. I think that by now we've got such much better tools for conversing with each other, for identifying those conflicts, for bringing them up, for resolving them, for doing so without being afraid of creating an even bigger conflict. That I would be surprised if we build another conflict that lasts 3 years before anybody does anything about it. So at the moment it feels like it's more for legacy conflicts here. So long as we do adopt this approach of actually dealing with the conflicts when they're smaller, which I think we're much more likely to do. I mean, we'll see. Maybe 5 years from now, you'll be like, aha, see?
Well, what's interesting is that these long-term conflicts, people are like, oh, well, as you said, like if you've been in conflict with someone for 5 years, oh my God, that must be a massive thing. And actually, it's because there was a fact. Actually, probably there was something quite small that started it off. And what's really the problem is the ongoing dynamic. So you can meet to fix that dynamic, right? That's what a lot of conflict resolution process is about coming into the room together face to face to say, there's been something wrong with our dynamic, we want a new dynamic, and actually that process is about saying, let's practice this new dynamic here together in a facilitated conversation. We have someone else to provide us with the support to do that, to make us feel safe, to try out these new behaviors, and then we get used to them, and then suddenly they become our default. Why did we ever need the support of facilitation? What a waste of time, because it's the new way of doing it. And actually, over the 5 years, maybe there have been some real problems, but actually one of the things that you see is, well, now that we're out of this loop and I've just sort of chosen to let go, right, difficult though letting go is, maybe actually those things are in the past. You said something to me 2 years ago that I find upsetting. Actually, that's, there's a really important point talking about that. No, it's done now. But you might discover in the midst of that there really were some things that you needed to fix. But having fixed the dynamic, you're in more of a position to do it.
Like using again the example of me and George, there were a number of things where I might still feel like they're unresolved. They're not things that I got a resolution for this problem that I could have discussed endlessly. But what I realized as part of the process is that I was part of. There was this loop going on. It wasn't just George being a dick. Like, I was doing my thing there, and I was doing quite a lot of things to contribute to this. So really, if I really wanted to go and discuss this, I'd have to spend a considerable amount of time first disentangling what I contributed to this versus what George contributed to this, and like how we interacted with each other in this way. And it just feels like if you've got the ability to work moving forward, you can just say, look, like we both fucked up on a number of things there over this period. We both contributed to this. Let's just draw a line and work well together from now on. Like, you know, shit happened that we both did something to make it happen. Just forget about that and move on.
But notice once you're out of the box, once you're empathizing with each other, you're saying, oh, we both just fucked up. Like, we're both just human beings, both just made mistakes, you know, on both sides. It's kind of done with. You know, I had a thing with Dom when we were talking at the feedback mingle, and he said, you know, we just weren't really seeing eye to eye last year. And I thought, this is exactly it. We just weren't really seeing eye to eye on some stuff. And yet now here we are saying to each other, you know, I really like it when you do this, but you know, this could really be better. But going, that's a really good point. And you know, a year ago we were just shouting at each other from one end or other of GrantTree fundamentals. I know I'm never going to watch that video. I did. But that's the thing, right? Because we've rebuilt empathy, something becomes easier. You know, I said just before the Christmas party, the stories thing about the conflict between George and Dan. I don't want to make this the only example, but it's a good example of of people who really stepped up to fixing this stuff. Is that actually once you rebuild that empathy, once you have a better dynamic, you're in a position where you see the similarities that you have, and perhaps they're bigger than you thought you were, but you also understand how to negotiate your difference. So you say, well, actually, other people are just going to do things that I don't like, or that I don't disagree with, or that I disagree with, or that I think could be better. And actually, some of those I'm just going to have to live with, because they're guess what? You know, they're not me. They're somebody else. They're going to do things differently. I'm just going to have to accept some of that. But actually, when you're in that empathetic framework, when you've got the kind of heart of peace, when you're out of the box, you know, whatever we call it, it's much easier for you to know, is this a problem that I need to do anything about, or actually, no, you know, or, well, actually, you know, I probably need to. And on the other side, you're like, oh, I've done that thing. Is that something that maybe I should send them some flowers. Maybe that wasn't a nice thing to do. Or maybe actually it would be fine if I just text. You sort of know what's proportional. What do you have to say?
I think on the time aspect, the way I see it a bit as well is, so I think you guys have covered it. A small thing is the source of the conflict, or it is from your point of view, and then you build these other layers of conflict over it, and it goes on for a really long time. But using the example of like 5 years, the way that people grow and evolve, I am unlikely to defend the actions of 5 years ago Nikki with real, you know, gusto, because I think that I've grown and evolved as a person a lot, and so I think like the issue that initially was the problem is maybe something that if you could even remember it as far back as what that original thing was, you might just not really care about it so much anyway. And like Andrew said, it's more the dynamic that's shaped around it that's the issue.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I guess I was more kind of thinking about conflict in general. Let's say there was 5 years worth of conflict, of which there may be many contributing factors. You know, that's kind of, I guess, but you know, your situation seems to make sense as well.
Anybody else?
I just want to say thank you to both you and Dan for sharing such personal examples, because to everyone, because I know that can be really hard. It was really good to hear, and personally in my opinion. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.